Hello, good evening or good afternoon. My name is Oliver Bradley, and I invite everybody, or I welcome everybody here to the panel Challenges that International Organizations Face in the International Arena. My name, as I said, is Oliver Bradley. I am the German and Italian language media advisor for the Europe-Israel Press Association. And what we try to explain to the media is how complex Israel is, and I'm sure we will find that also Israel's involvement in human rights issues will be very complex also, positively and sometimes maybe even negatively, but we will have the experts here address the topic. So basically, what I will do is I will just give a brief introduction to our panelists. To my left, so to everybody's right, is Noam Katz. He's a Senior Deputy General Director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Jerusalem. Prior to his current position, Mr. Katz served as Minister of Public Diplomacy at the Embassy of Israel in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure he will probably be able to expand a little bit more his work experiences and how he's brought that into his current work. Then to my right, we have Hillel Neuer. He's Canadian-born international lawyer, writer, executive director of the UN Watch, a human rights NGO, and UN watchdog group based in Geneva, Switzerland. UN Watch is a Geneva-based non-governmental organization whose mission it is to monitor the performance of the United Nations by its own charter. And we know how controversial the Charter of the United Nations is. I don't think for anybody who's here we have to get too much into that. I think Mr. Neuer will expand on his experiences, and we know that they're very, very interesting and always very current. To my left, so to your right, or to the right of me, I'm going to try to play ping pong a little bit. We have Olga Deutsch, who's a graduate of the University of Belgrade and the University of Munich. She has been awarded a fellowship with the Ford Motor Company, graduating as a community leader at the School of International Public Affairs of Columbia University in New York. She is how would you define yourself, actually?
Head of Europe Desk.
She's the head of the Europe Desk of the NGO Monitor, a non-governmental organization based in Jerusalem, which analyzes and reports on the output of the international NGO community from a pro-Israel point of view. It has sometimes its controversies, but controversies always animate, I think, every discussion, and I think she will then be able to elaborate on her work, which is, I think, very, very, very important in today's day and age. And then further to my left, we have Asaf, Dr. Asaf Romirowsky, Executive Director of the Scholars for Peace in the Middle East. He's also a fellow of the Middle East Forum and a professional affiliate of the University of Iowa Did I say Iowa? Haifa. I'm sorry about that. My dad went to the University of Iowa. It's a good university. Trained as a Middle East historian, he holds a PhD in Middle East and Mediterranean Studies from King's College in London. The Scholars for Peace in the Middle East is a non-for-profit or grassroots community organization who's made up of scholars who talk about the civil discourse, especially regarding the Middle East. They believe that ethnic, national, and religious hatreds, including anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism, have no place in our institutions. I think this is probably a good start because this is one of the big topics that we have about human rights in general. Whose human rights and what does human rights mean? And I would say perhaps because I would say the state of Israel being the focal point of a lot of criticism on its own human rights record, is a country that's faced with double standards all the time. So perhaps we start with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and Noam Katz could elaborate on his work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. And first, it's a pleasure to be with a company of people that each one of them is an expert on the topic that we are going to talk about. My perspective is the perspective of the public diplomacy of the State of Israel. And when I want to talk about public diplomacy, I want to put in a nutshell a kind of definition. Public diplomacy is the orchestrated, concerted effort of the State of Israel to promote its interest when it comes to the public arena, public and media arena. And public diplomacy is handling everything that is below government to government. And in that environment of civil society, in that environment sometimes of business community, what you try to do is to generate support that will influence sometimes government, sometimes will cement relations between the states. And you are dealing with target audiences and with the civil society organization, which human rights organizations are part of. And in the equation of influence within states, civil society organization and human rights organizations are becoming more and more powerful. In our researches, and we know today to say that human rights organizations are enjoying more credibility in their own states than the government. So you can imagine how it looks like for the Israeli government when it has to stand against a human rights organization in another country. These organizations are not state organizations. They are crossing states, and therefore their influence is greater than could expect from a local organization, whatever type of organization it is. When we look on organization, and not necessarily human rights organizations, we tend to look on bodies, institutions, organizations, on the line between friend and enemy, the frenemy line. And it means that at any certain point, we can be, it's like a quantum in several places. I can think about doing things with UNICEF in Africa and fully cooperate. And I can stand and criticize UNICEF, or they can criticize me on the practices of the State of Israel when it comes to the Palestinian Authority or to Gaza. So it's not either you are with us or you are against us. You can be at the same time in both places. Having said that, we need to understand that, or maybe before that, I would say, Israel is a democracy. That should be clear to everyone here in this room. And Israel has a vivid, energetic civil society of itself. And Israel values human rights, period. And when we deal with human rights organizations and their practices towards Israel, we see a big gap. Think for a minute on Germany or on this city, Frankfurt. I'm sure that you have as big debate as we have in Israel on refugees and immigrants. But it will be reported differently when it comes to Israel, and it will be reported, if at all, by those organizations when it comes to Germany. There will be no special country report of Human Rights Watch on Germany. Now, it doesn't correspond with the facts. So why it is happening? First, it happens because those organizations are invested in the conflict in the Middle East, and they have strong presence in the region. Secondly, they have sometimes political and ideological motivation that influence the way that they see the situation. But the outcome is that Israel is presented in a very unproportional way. Those organizations adopted for themselves a kind of stance of beacon of light, but they are not open to criticism on their practices. And in fact, they see themselves beyond such kind of criticism, and they don't feel that they have to be accountable. I'm sure that some of my friends will be able to give some shocking examples for that. Certainly Hillel Neuer that deal with that in Geneva on a daily basis. So one part is the need to be able to criticize them. So we need, instead of Human Rights Watch, we need Human Rights Watch. And we need to generate certain kind of ongoing pressure on them, because we think that these organizations are important. We think that they are totally wrong about Israel and its practices. The second element that I miss in the operation of all these guards is ignoring the kind of society that we have in Israel. As I said, Israel is an open society. In the Jewish DNA, there is the idea of tikkun olam, and whoever was here in previous sessions could hear about beautiful things that are being done by Israel's civil society, sometimes government, and sometimes Israeli civil society and government. Imagine who would give care to Syrian injured people from the civil war. It's an enemy country. And still Israel was engaged in that, and the Israeli civil society was involved and contributed. And Israeli organizations were active in Syria and outside of Syria. Israel is sending assistance to all kinds of countries when they have all kinds of shocking events. It can be a natural disaster, it can be the killing in Miami, or it can be fire in California. Because we have generated mechanism in our society, we built all kinds of patterns that can be shared with others. It can be the trauma organization that knows how to deal with traumatic societies. It can be Ichud Hatzalah that give medical treatment to people and organize communities to give better treatment. It can be on education level, etc. All this is being regarded usually when it's to create a balanced frame of the Israeli society as a kind of whitewashing. It seems sometimes when you read or listen to the people and to the activists of those organizations that Israel is doing what it is doing only to hide behind it what they call the Israeli brutal occupation, ignoring also the reason why there is occupation, etc., and the need to solve that conflict, and that conflict will be eventually solved around negotiating table in a process that we hope will come sooner the better. If I have one ask from you, or two asks, I would say. One is to be tuned to that and to collaborate and cooperate with all the civil society organizations that are sitting here, that are aware of the issue, that raise a voice when they see the injustice in the practices of human rights organizations. Don't spill the organizations are important. Their practices towards Israel are wrong. And secondly, if you can find enough people that will join one day those organizations and change them from within, that will be a great idea. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Noam. There was a key word that you were saying, also education and educating people as to what's actually going on. So maybe we just take that word education and just go on to Asaf, who represents Scholars for Peace.
Sure.
The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Pleasure to be on the panel with friends and colleagues. Spent the past 20-some years actually dissecting one of the challenges as it relates to the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic as it relates to a UN group known as Unruh. which is devoted to Arab Palestinian refugees and has become the facade for dealing with a lot of these issues. But let me just, I'll get into Unruh as an example, as kind of a case study, but let me try to explain the environment, to kind of piggyback into to Noam's comments about the challenge in general. And as an American, I guess on the panel here, I'll talk about a little bit about the U.S. scene and what's happening in academia. Human rights in the United States and a problem that we're seeing, in particular also today in the American Jewish community, is a facade for good work. And so everybody talks about, I would go even deeper to Noam's point about Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam has become a religion. And it's actually become what I would consider to be a replacement theology for actually, instead of practicing religiosity, is actually practicing Tikkun Olam as a kind of a halo effect for these kind of good work that is needed. To that end, there is a pass that is given to many organizations because of the facade of this good work. Another phenomenon that you're seeing today in the United States that I would say is trickling into Europe is, of course, the rise of identity politics. And identity politics has created an environment whereby people's opinions are based on their opinions, not based on facts. That understanding is also translated kindly into the idea of human rights. And so many of these organizations who feel that they are doing good work are getting a pass because we want to help prepare the world, we want to make the world a better place, and we have an obligation to solve many of these issues. In the case study of the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic as it relates to how this narrative is being cascaded, Israel is considered to be the worst human rights abuser in every possible way. If you had to chart and grade Israel, Israel is always out there. The other part, related, of course, there's a total disconnect between that reality and the reality on the ground. However, Israel gets no passes on this issue. Israel is basically accused with this architecture. These human rights organizations, or claim to be human rights organizations, all have a political agenda. Let's be clear about this. They have an ideology. They have a political agenda. They hide behind a facade of neutrality, but they all come with a clear architecture. They are bureaucracies that are driven by donor monies. No bureaucracy has any incentive, in particular, which I'm sure Hillel will talk about later on, in the United Nations has any incentive in going out of business. And as a result of that, they have to maintain this facade, the good work that they are doing. As it relates to the case study of my friends at Unruh, Unruh has become the gatekeeper of the perception of Arab Palestinian refugees fleeing for their lives. Again, another code word, of course, is refugees, as there's a kind of a cognitive dissonance that exists as it relates to people fleeing for their lives, do not have a steady home as a result of a ongoing atrocities, similar to an environment that you would see in Sudan or other African countries. That is not the environment as it relates to Arab Palestinian refugees. However, we have accepted that organization as the gatekeeper of this reputation. To that end, we've also contributed, up until now, the Trump administration has frozen the money, but the United States has contributed kindly about a third of UNRWA's annual budget, about $400 million a year of U.S. taxpayer dollars, based on the perception of solving these issues and solving refugee problems, solving issues related to poverty, starvation, and whatnot, though the reality on the ground is very different and very complicated. But the image, again, when you use these code phrases, gives the impression that we need to solve and deal with these matters. As such, we have given these monies and continue to do so. The reality is that with the rise of identity politics, with the way Israel is being perceived and graded within the larger culture itself, there is no way Israel can get ahead of dealing with the narrative. And the human rights groups in itself groups like Human Rights Watch and others make sure to maintain that agenda. I mean, the politics are become very complicated. During the war in 2012 and in 2014, one of the key lobbyists who advocates for UNRWA in Washington happens to be a former State Department individual. And so again, the State Department, in the United States has also become a guardian of these matters. And so you're dealing with a very complicated political architecture where policymakers in Washington are forced to make decisions based on supposed facts, when again, the reality is very different. As it relates to the education, to Oliver's point, UNRWA today, again, has become its only functionality beyond what it was supposed to do and intended to do as far as providing refugee relief and with the ultimate goal of what was considered to be in the 1950s and 60s resettlement, repatriation, and reintegration as it relates to the Arab Palestinians, where we have failed in every account. Today, UNRWA only provides education. That kind of education is the kind of education that is being cascaded in every UNRWA school, and that has nothing to do with reality. Israel is not mentioned. Nakba is a religion. The only Holocaust, by the way, that it only exists is the Nakba. Back in the Oslo years, we used to ask queries, how is it possible that Palestinian kids or Palestinian society does not question or ask about the Holocaust? You do not ever dare to break that echo chamber. Anybody who does, I know my colleague and friend Muhammad Dajani was speaking today, but you get fired if you dare to break that understanding. So there is a very clear, concise message to how this process works. Beyond that, which is something we should be aware of course, is the finances. The money dictates the politics, and the individuals who are portraying this facade go on to make that very clear. Individuals like the current queen of Jordan, Queen Rania, is herself of Palestinian descent. She is one of the key fundraiser individuals for UNRWA at large. Again, so when the Arab world says this must be so, and of course I have suffered as a result of that, then it is so. And so that is the kind of the political reality that deals with all of this. But it is critical to understand that, and all of us in this room I'm sure are aware, the Middle East is a very complicated issue. The disingenuous part about what you're seeing today with the rise of what I would consider to be identity politics, basically compounded by human rights politics, don't afford any realistic dissecting of the rich history that we need to tackle as it relates to the Middle East politics at large. And so I agree. I mean, we do have to hold these organizations accountable, to my colleague's friend Noam here, as it relates to dealing with these organizations. But I would go even deeper. I mean, I think that all money, needs to be looked at very carefully. I mean, I think that there has to be a clear dissection of where the money comes from and what kind of politics are involved with that. We have found over the past few years, and this is not only unique to UNRWA, but to other kind of UN agencies and other kind of human rights groups where money is tainted money. And so if money is indeed tainted, money should be frozen. It's not okay to say that because you're only doing one good thing, then you get a pass on the other thing because that was a good cause. You can't play it both ways. And so that's part of the challenging element that plays out to this. Now, what you find today as, again, what I would consider to be the soft power of academia, you have a rise within North American politics as well as in European politics. I mean, Europe actually started a lot of peace and conflict studies and human rights studies and whatnot. That same kind of narrative or so-called scholarship has trickled down into academia, journalism, and so these facts are presented as actual facts when they really have nothing to do with reality itself. So there's a whole infrastructure that plays into all of this. It's not only the organizations on the ground that are indeed supposedly doing the good work, they are dictated by the funders, how they cascade the message, and of course, the feeders on the ground who are studying these topics, getting master's degrees and graduate degrees and whatnot, and then later on going to do the work that they are supposed to be doing based on the tainted politics. That cycle needs to be broken. Otherwise, all we will see is a monolithic understanding of the Middle East in particular, but in particular the Israeli-Palestinian dynamic, which is black and white. This is part of the challenge and part of the, I would say, the tainted environment by trying to do good by actually doing bad work. I mean, that's part of the ideology that you're seeing play into the politics. So on that note, I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Asaf. I think this brings us to Olga because one of her main tasks is accountability, and I suppose how can these organizations justify themselves? And I would say probably just from my lay point of view, a lack of accountability for the monies that they're getting, etc. But Olga can delve into that topic.
Good afternoon, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here with colleagues and friends, and thank you all of you for joining us this afternoon in discussing this and being brave enough to be activists. It's not easy. I would like to actually start on more of a positive note. Civil society is a good thing. We are all representatives of civil society. It is not only a good thing, but it is a backbone of any democracy. We are fortunate to live in the 20th and 21st century where that has been the most prosperous, the most peaceful in humankind's history. And it is to be accredited to a certain extent to the opportunity of any one of us to just be an activist, to voice our opinion. Civil society is a complementary force to modern democracy and to governments. In a way, it should be the morale of a government, a platform that can, on one hand, criticize, and on the other hand, make any one government better. It is a channel through which, if we don't want to get elected and have a sit in the parliament, through which we can still voice our opinions and be part of a political discourse and part of a decision-making process. So I think also when we talk about Israel and the human rights industry, as it is always or very often called, it is important to never lose sight that civil society and NGOs are a good thing. And we should also probably try to approach it as such, even when we want to criticize them. I come from the business sector. That's my actual background. And I tend to look at the society as a threefold, or three markets, if you'd like. We have the business sector. So you have the rules of the market and the law that will, if in case there's an anomaly, they will rectify any one mistake, and then if someone is not filing their taxes or someone is not claiming their profits, there will be sanctions. Then we have the public sector, and if someone is not doing a very good job and they're a member of the parliament, in the best case scenario, they will not get elected again. But when it comes to the civil society, there are no such mechanisms in place because it is something that grew grassroots, from the grassroots, and this was a way of people to organize themselves and organize themselves in a non-organized manner, if you'd like, because anyone can create an NGO today. It's a little bit more difficult in some countries, very easy in some other countries. If you don't need a tax-deductible status, then it is very easy. And if you're good at fundraising and you have very good people skills, in no time you can be strutting down the corridors of any one parliament in the world making your case. And it's a legitimate thing to do. But because there are no mechanisms to cross-reference or check what any one of the NGOs are doing out there and whether they are disseminating facts that are proven, or politicized messages, then we face a situation today where things like what Asaf was talking about are possible, and phenomena that Noam was referring to are, when it comes to Israel, have become a reality. But if we want to try to zoom out even more, we need to put the civil society in a broader context. Civil society goes hand in hand with what is called development aid, which basically means, and this probably started in Europe. Europe is the cradle of the civil society. Europe also prides itself as a continent that very generous. You can hear me? Okay. I'm not starting from the beginning.
Remember the last sentence you said.
European governments are probably the most generous because it is in their tradition and in the raison d'etre, how they approach the civil society. They're supporting the civil society and they see it as part of their DNA to engage inside of Europe and outside of it through development aid. And this is actually how we see that European governments, EU and European governments, they fund and support many of the big NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and or the smaller ones that many of you maybe haven't heard of. And what happens in practice is that we find civil society organizations sort of representing the governments because in many cases they enjoy governmental budgets, 95% of their total budgets. And then there's a question, to what extent are they non-governmental governments? There's all kinds of questions that no one really knows how to answer. And they're tasked or commissioned to promote human rights, to promote humanitarian causes, and they're sent off to probably the most dangerous or complicated areas in the world, conflict-ridden areas, Arab-Israeli conflict being only one of them, places that face the gravest humanitarian disasters, and we have NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who are tasked in solving these or bringing two people closer together, brokering peace. Now, going back to my original statement that there are no checks and balances and no one is cross-referencing what these organizations are actually doing, we have a problem in the field. I'll give you an example from earlier this year. German Organization for International Cooperation, Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit. This is officially a non-governmental organization, but it was created with the sole purpose and was commissioned by the Ministry for Development, the Bundesministerium für Zusammenarbeit, and enjoys its direct budget. It's commissioned to promote and carry out, implement German projects in the field of development aid. They operate around the world. They have tens of thousands of employees, and most of the times they do amazing work. But there was a story that broke in the news earlier this year where one of their employees in Jordan got caught into a political debate around the arrest of Ahed Tamimi. And most of her co-workers and people on her personal Facebook account were commenting how brutal the Israeli army was in arresting her, and she's just a minor, etc. And she made a comment that if a similar case happened in Germany, to begin with, this girl would be arrested, and then there would be a trial or an investigation, etc. I'm not even going to go into who is right or who is wrong, but I'm telling you what happened. Her comment, they made a screenshot of her comment, and they went on a witch hunt in the social media. But even worse than that, they reported to her superiors, both in Amman and in Germany. Consequently, her contract, after 7 years, was not renewed, and she was let go. Now, before she left her position, she actually made sure to check how some of her other colleagues working for Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit were expressing their opinions politically, and she consequently went to the press, and it was made public that many of the employees some here in Germany at the headquarters and some in Ramallah, some in Jordan, some in Egypt, were spreading violent anti-Semitism. All of them were very biased when it comes to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And one particular employee who worked for the headquarters here in Germany was, at the end of this process, fired because he, in his social media, he, amongst other things, he published an Israeli flag where the Star of David was replaced by the swastika. Now, this is a governmental, or basically an organization commissioned by the German government to promote projects in development aid. The employees of this agency enjoy semi-diplomatic passports. So they're not seen as diplomats, but they enjoy many of the benefits that a German diplomat would have because they're sent off to conflict-ridden areas to do very important work. If we're going to look at bottom-up, okay, I want to give you another example. Palestinian Network, NGO Network. It's an umbrella organization for 134 Palestinian NGOs, most of them most prominent Palestinian NGOs. They sort of serve as a representative body for the Palestinian civil society. They sit on the advisory board of UN's emergency fund in the area, which grants them a voice in making decisions over enormous amounts of money, of funds that is being then distributed to NGOs. At the same time, they, a few years ago, when USAID, who by the way has the most stringent criteria when it comes to terror, USAID wanted to introduce a clause in every contract so that when they decide to fund an NGO, that NGO has to commit itself to not promote terror, not have ties to terror, etc. And this umbrella organization said our 134 members are not allowed to sign this clause. The same PNGO went on to condemn and reject EU's peace-building initiative. In their charter, they say our members should not pursue any normalization activities with the occupier, culturally, people to people, art, in no area. Earlier this year, there was a center, a building that was named after Dalal Mughrabi, who is a bona fide terrorist who participated in one of the terror attacks. And when this became public, 3 European countries decided to defund the organization who inaugurated the building. PNGO, again, who represents 134 Palestinian NGOs, said they condemned this and called it funding conditionality, sort of you are telling us how to do our job and you're not supposed to do that, you should only give us money. I'm giving these two examples because they're showing a phenomenon from two different perspectives. On one hand, you have administration and official governmental agencies who are supposed to engage with the civil society in the context of the development aid. And on the other hand, you have the NGOs who try to push for their agenda. And somewhere in there lies the challenge. I actually want to just in maybe 3 sentences try to organize what I think are the actual challenges in the field of human rights. I think the number one, and this is something that both Asaf and Noam spoke about, is an attempt to do the de-romanticization of civil society. And this is not to say that we should not continue to empower it and to promote it, but we need to be able to critically look at what civil society organizations do. And this should be done with the mandate of trying to make them better, with the mandate of trying to make them more accountable vis-à-vis themselves and vis-à-vis the outside world. The second challenge that we face is something that in literature is called the fringe effect. Okay? The fringe effect in literature is a phenomenon that says the fringest of stories are the ones who make it to the media. or if you'd like, in a colloquial language, good news is no news. So actually, this was very obvious in the case of 9/11, where it was the fringest anti-Muslim or Islamophobic organizations who usually got to the media and got the coverage because they were carrying out the craziest of stories. But then when these are the things that are reported about in the media, they tend to create a reality in which we live. The third challenge is the administration, and it's very dry, if you'd like. We need to be more organized in how we draft the contracts with NGOs. When any one government wishes to grant funds to an NGO, that's okay, but there should be clauses and clear boundaries, what is allowed and what is not. Administration should also, usually governments say we support projects and not organizations, which in practice could mean there's an NGO operating in Gaza. They might be connected to Hamas, but we only engage with them in that particular project where they're giving out sandwiches to the kids. And we live in a much more complex and complicated world where we cannot separate so easily between things. And then actually, Denmark and Netherlands, just in the last few months, made very significant steps in that sense. They introduced new selection criteria to how they engage with NGOs. And they say NGO that receives funds from our taxpayers' money cannot have ties to terror, cannot promote anti-Semitism. Actually, in these two countries, they even include BDS in their new selection criteria. So steps are being made, and we need to continue promoting this. And the final challenge, I think, is on the legislative level, which is with the decision makers in parliaments across Europe and globally. And they are the ones who are actually accountable to the taxpayers, because they decide where the budgets and where the taxpayers' money in any one country are going. Switzerland last year passed a legislation that says Swiss taxpayers' money will not go to organizations who promote hate speech, anti-Semitism, and or have ties to terror. It might sound like a straightforward and a very logical thing, but this was groundbreaking in Europe, not only in Switzerland, because, again, moving back to the first challenge that I described, we need to de-romanticize civil society. We need to be in a position to critically look at that. With the legislative level, I also think that, and with this I would like to finish, we need to go back to looking at this in a positive light. Civil society is a good thing. Governments to governments need to engage, and ministers of foreign affairs and ministers to foreign affairs need to engage in a bilateral and regional dialogues. Just because something is a controversial subject does not mean that countries who have good relations on any other issue cannot also engage in. If we don't always have to agree, but we can at least talk about it. And if we are capable of bringing members of the Bundestag with members of the Knesset together to at least voice the issues that they on their respective sides have when it comes to how each one of them engages with the civil society, then that would be the first and very important step. I'll finish here because I'm sure there will be questions.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Prime Minister are intensively engaged of this kind of discourse with different governments. It is raised in any dialogue as part of the dialogue, and part of the changes are part of the changes in the behavior of government is part of that dialogue.
It's very important.
I would say probably to sum up already what we've heard here before we go to Hillel is transparency is a major issue, and people's perceptions. I mean, I always think it's kind of funny how people's perceptions of the down and out Palestinian is, but the Queen of Jordan is a glamorous woman, and she is an example of how mindsets need to be changed, especially what is a refugee today. I mean, the Queen of Jordan is a refugee. I mean, but she's a Queen of Jordan. So anyway, half a joke aside, I would like to, though, probably just temper one thing. There's a lot of discussion with governments today, and we have very good realities happening that are in Israel's favor, but I will be very provocative. That's this generation. It's not going to be easy in the next political generation of young people who we have not reached and who are engaging in social media structures that are, let's say, very non-transparent and very conspirative. This is going to be the biggest challenge, but it's the challenge that we're facing not just for this topic, in general. How is news being spread, and what do people's perceptions, what will those be in the future? So right now, I think probably a lot of you know what especially has been going on with the United Nations, because it's in the news quite often. And Hillel Neuer could perhaps just give us a brief summary of maybe some anecdotes, if anything, maybe for what, maybe bring us to laugh at something. I don't know, because sometimes it's just so tragically sad. Yeah.
Plug in, so I'll have some power when it's all over. So thank you for the introduction, and it's great to be on the panel with friends for some years. We're doing terrific work, so congratulations for all of you. I was asked to share some anecdotes and to make people laugh, so see what we can do. Since we're speaking about the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, that shouldn't be too hard, right? Since I recognize a number of faces who heard me earlier today in the plenary, I'll try not to repeat myself on things that I already spoke about on the topic, but I'll just do a recap because I'll share a few anecdotes, as I was just asked. Earlier today, I spoke about what would it be like if Eleanor Roosevelt and René Cassin, the founders of human rights at the United Nations, would come alive and see what became of their highest human rights body, then called the... Pardon? They would go back immediately. Voilà. So then it was called the Commission on Human Rights in 2006. They said, we change it, we make it better, big reform, we call it Human Rights Council. So they changed one name, and of course it's the same Dreck. I don't know if the word exists in German, it's the word in Yiddish. Yeah, so it's the same nonsense. The members then were Cuba and Saudi Arabia and China, and the members today are Cuba, Saudi Arabia, and China. So, but now it's called the Council. It used to be called the Commission. Okay, so V, as we say, reform. So what are we facing at the Human Rights Council? I mentioned today when it comes to the rest of the world that we've never seen a single resolution ever on 1.3 billion people in China. Turkey fires 100,000 people, throws journalists in prison, exiled, nothing. Pakistan, people throw acid on women's faces for honor violations. Christian women are on death row for blasphemy. Never a single resolution, and we could go on and on for 180 countries, when the worst countries, and there's nothing. So this is what we're up against, and of course, instead, there is a obsessive focus on Israel. Like everyone here, I don't think Israel gets a free pass. There are issues in Israel. I worked in Israel. I worked on the Supreme Court. Of course there are issues. Like there are issues here in Germany, where I live, in Switzerland, where I grew up in Canada. There are human rights issues in every country, and Israel should be held to account. And I don't claim that everything in Israel is perfect, and people who are friends of Israel believe that, like in our own countries, you make a country stronger by doing constructive criticism, by having an independent judiciary, which Israel has. Israel has the most independent judiciary in the world. I know, because I worked there. And I saw how issues in real time of defense and foreign affairs, which in America, they would immediately say, that's a political question, we don't deal with in the courts. And many other countries. In Israel, within a day, you can be in the highest court of the country, in the Supreme Court, sitting as Bagatz, as the High Court of Justice, which is a relic from the British era, when the British didn't want the native Arab or Israeli judges holding the British mandatory government to account, so that was only the highest court. If you brought a human rights case to complain against the government, it had to be only to the highest court, which were British judges. And Israel has that today. You can go to the highest court of the land within moments to challenge a military issue at the border, and so Israel has the most activist, independent judiciary in the world, and it has the most activist free press in the world. Read Haaretz, right? I'm not sure. There's not that many newspapers. Maybe today under Trump, the New York Times and CNN on Trump, maybe it's equal today. So, you know, Israel is not perfect. There are many things to criticize. You can criticize his government. But as we see what we see at the United Nations is that the treatment of Israel has nothing to do with trying to make Israel better. It's everything to do with demonizing, scapegoating, delegitimizing the state of Israel and by extension the Jewish people. So I mentioned today different examples, and I spoke of some experts. I mentioned Jean Ziegler. He's the longest serving UN human rights expert. Okay, he's the guy I mentioned. He created the Gaddafi Prize for Human Rights, and you know, very good friend of Castro and many other dictators. And of course, the other expert who was there for many years, for 6 years, is Richard Falk, the expert on Palestine, who, before he was appointed as the UN objective, independent, impartial expert on Palestine, had published an article entitled Slouching Toward a Palestinian Holocaust, how he claimed Israel was planning a genocide against the Palestinian people. I went to the president of the Human Rights Council. I said, Mr. President, he's a good man. He's from Romania. It changes every year, the president. I said, you're about to appoint this man as the UN expert on human rights in Palestine. And if Israel doesn't receive him, you'll be very upset. And the mandate says he must be objective, impartial, non-political, etc. And he just wrote this article saying Israel is committing a genocide against the Palestinians. And he said to me, Hillel, I've seen the article. But I have to tell you that on this nomination, the Arab and Islamic states told me he's the guy. And on this issue, my hands are tied. There's nothing I can do. And they appointed Richard Falk, and he spent 6 years not only attacking Israel, but he's so anti-Israel that he became pro-Hamas. Right? This is an American professor, a radical professor. He became so pro-Hamas that secretly, we only learned a few years later, you all know WikiLeaks? WikiLeaks were these documents of American diplomatic cables, right? These are the emails, the communications between Washington, State Department, and the embassies in London, Paris, Rome, Geneva, where I work at the Human Rights Council, the United Nations in Geneva. And they were all published on the internet. Someone leaked them. And it's hundreds of thousands of cables. It's fascinating, just as a student of international politics. So I went to go see it. Did they mention my name? Yes, something very small. I came to a meeting. I mentioned nothing interesting. But I checked other names. Richard Falk, it's mentioned. Secret cable, what does it say? The American number 2 in Geneva had a meeting with the Palestinian mission, the Palestinian delegate in Geneva, the number 2. And the Palestinian comes to the American, this is around 2010 or 2009, and he says, please, American delegate, can you help me? This guy, Richard Falk, he's the UN expert, special rapporteur on Palestine. We don't like him. Quietly, right? Secretly, we don't like him. He talks about the Holocaust a lot. It's not helping us. And he likes Hamas. We're Fatah. We hate Hamas. We have civil war with Hamas. We despise them. Since 1974, we are the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Since Yasser Arafat came with his holster, welcomed by all. I don't know if Waldheim was still a Secretary General then, right? Arafat came with the sunglasses and the keffiyeh. Those of a certain age will remember that moment. That's when it began at the UN, and it's never changed since then, right? The resolutions, the year later was Zionism is racism. So we are the sole, how can he says that Hamas, Richard Falk said, Hamas should be able to present to the UN. They should be able to submit directly to the UN, right? And we want you to help us fire him. We called Richard Falk. We told him, please leave. Please quit. He said, no, I don't quit. Can you, the Americans, help us remove him? And the American said, this is under the Obama years. I don't know if it's because of that, but he said, I can't help you. He said, you can't fire a UN rapporteur. There's no rule. You can appoint them, but you can't fire them. It doesn't exist. I can't help you. Sorry, I can't help you. So this isn't a secret cable. Publicly, the PLO stands up, says, we love you, Mr. Falk, everything is great. But secretly, he was so pro-Hamas. Okay, so these is what we're up against. I mentioned earlier today, one agenda item on the whole world, one agenda item on Israel. We counted the first 10 years of the Council. How many resolutions on the whole world? We counted all the countries. Whenever they did something on Syria, something on Iran, something on North Korea, something on Myanmar, we counted everything. The whole world in 10 years, from 2006 to 2016, 67 resolutions we counted. And then we counted on Israel, 68 on Israel. Okay, so 67 on the whole world, 192 countries. Israel, 68 resolutions. More resolutions on Israel than the rest of the world combined. Okay, so this in a nutshell, because I don't want to speak very long today. This is what we're up against. It's the campaign to demonize and delegitimize the state of Israel. Why is it happening? The Arab and Islamic countries who introduced the resolutions, they have had a long, war with Israel, even though now, of course, it changes on the ground. Secretly, privately, Egypt, Saudi, but still publicly, there is tremendous hatred for the idea of Israel in all of these countries. And then the question is, well, why do countries like Germany and other EU countries, again, I don't want to single out Germany, but why do they go along with so many of them? In Geneva, maybe 60%, 70%. In New York, 75% of the 20 anti-Israel resolutions that are being adopted this month, the EU states will all vote yes. On 5 of them, they abstain. On no, nothing will they vote no on. Why do they go along? This is an educated audience of activists. The Arab states have oil. The Arab states have money, sovereign wealth funds. If you live in France and you want to sell your football team, Paris Saint-Germain, to Qatar, well, you have to be nice to them or you don't get the billions of dollars, right? We know how Saudi can buy or Qatar can buy an entire elite of any country if they want to. And then you have to understand at the United Nations, something that people don't always understand, vote trading, right? The UN works by vote trading. You vote for me, I vote for you. Canada, my country, I'm very embarrassed. There was an article last week, not about Israel, but it was very educational. You may have heard that American diplomats in Cuba, past couple of years, past 2 years maybe, came down with a terrible illness. Brain concussion injuries, sound, strange things happen to 20 American diplomats working in Havana. And the experts say that something strange, that probably some hostile government, either Cuba or one of their allies sitting in Havana, is maybe putting some kind of a microwave weapon that's causing major injuries in their brain, blood, terrible things happening to them. And now recently it emerges in Canada's Globe and Mail newspaper, it's the leading newspaper of Canada, that Canadian diplomats say we also had it. And we need medical help. We need to go to America where they now have an expert in treating this, they call it already a Havana syndrome. And the Canadian government, they don't help us. The diplomats, right? It's a secret, they're anonymous story in the newspaper saying that we don't like to talk about what our government is doing publicly because we're diplomats, we do things quietly, but our colleagues are becoming sick. We have maybe 10 colleagues, maybe more, who are sick, and Canada's not helping. Why is the government not helping? Why is the government quiet? Because Canada, turns out, Justin Trudeau, wants to be elected to the Security Council. And it turns out that Cuba is a small country, it's not very rich, but they're very influential in the whole third world. The non-aligned movement, the African, Asian states, that Cuba for many years has been the chair of the non-aligned movement, or its puppets in Venezuela. They have enormous influence in those countries. So if Canada, this is not me speaking, these are Canadian diplomats talking about their colleagues who are sick and trying to understand why in Ottawa they don't help. And they say that Canada wants to be in the Security Council. So now imagine, not in Cuba, let's move to Israel. Why is Canada now on new resolutions, when there was a resolution to condemn Israel for defending itself, when Hamas sent thousands of people to the border, these civilian, innocent, peaceful protests, and you see the people with their axes and their guns and their bombs, and they say they want to go across into Israel to kill Israelis. And Canada abstained, right? The UN condemned Israel. Canada should have voted no. Like America, I believe Australia, if I'm not mistaken, Canada abstained. And of course, I understand why. Why is Canada now giving money to UNRWA, which was mentioned, which under Prime Minister Stephen Harper, they gave zero money to UNRWA. But Justin Trudeau wants to be elected to the Security Council. So vote trading, okay? People need the 56 Islamic states, 56 votes, and whatever issue you have in your country, you want those 56 votes. You could be Germany, you could be Belgium. You need those votes or you will not be elected to the Security Council. And for diplomats, they must be on the Security Council, right? So this is how it works. Finally, of course, I would say there are some diplomats, I think, who have a certain pleasure in condemning Israel, the Jewish state, for various reasons, that Israel has become the Jew among the nations, and I think this is beyond realpolitik, this is beyond raison d'etat, other psychological, supra-rational factors at play as well. But what I want to share with you briefly, maybe in 5 minutes, is how do we fight back, right? People come up to me, they say, Hillel, we see the videos, we see your work, but it's useless, there's nothing you can do, give up. I used to study constitutional law. It was very nice. I was in the library. I was comparing constitutions. I was enjoying it very much. Why do you go there? They hate you. There's nothing you can do. And, well, actually, I believe that you can fight back. And I believe that it's essential that those of us who care for the truth, those of us who care for the right of the State of Israel to exist and to flourish for another 70 years and beyond, must stand up and speak the truth, whatever the results are. But I believe we can fight back. And I share with you just 3 brief anecdotes. One is diplomacy. I believe that we must meet with governments who are decent. You're not going to meet the North Koreans, and you're not going to meet Assad, but meet EU governments who, there are decent people there. They do things that are often wrong, sometimes not. We must meet with them. We must encourage them to do the right thing. My group, UN Watch, based in Geneva, we try to meet with diplomats, and sometimes you can have an effect. Back in 2009, there was this terrible thing called the Durban II Racism Conference. The first one was 2001, where US and Israel pulled out. A World Racism Conference that condemned only one country as racist, the State of Israel, and Jewish activists, students were running for their lives, afraid of the mob of thousands who said Hitler was right, he should have finished the job, at a UN World Racism Conference. The second one was 2009, across the street from my office in Geneva. We led the calls together with many other groups and governments, and we were examining and exposing how the conference had breached the red lines that some EU leaders had said publicly. And by the day the conference opened in April 17th or 18th, 2009, not only US and Israel, but Canada were the first country to pull out, Italy pulled out, Czech Republic pulled out, Germany pulled out, the Netherlands pulled out. You had 10 major countries. And if you ask a European diplomat, tell me, Mr. Ambassador, what do you do? He said, what do you do for a living? He said, I go to UN conferences, right? If you go in Geneva and if you see all the black Mercedes cars, some of them are BMW, what do? I go to the UN conferences. But suddenly 10 major countries pulled out, and that was a very important thing. Sometimes lobbying can make a difference. I'll give you one other example, is the British government in the past 2 years, not in New York. In New York, they continue to vote with EU against Israel, 75% of the resolutions. But in Geneva, for some reason, they said, no, this is wrong. And 2 years ago, they stood up and gave a speech, and the ambassador said, he said, kind of what I just told you now. He said, this is absurd. He said Israel should be criticized. We're against settlements, blah, blah, blah. But this is absurd. You have an obsessive treatment of Israel. He said, you condemn Israel for being on the Golan Heights at a time when Israel is rescuing thousands of Syrians, bringing them into hospitals and saving their lives, and you condemn Israel for being on the Golan Heights. This is absurd. We are going to change our vote. Now we vote no to this resolution. In the past, we abstained. Now we vote no. And if this bias continues, the United Kingdom will vote no on all resolutions. Okay? That was 2 years ago. This past year, they changed their vote again on one other resolutions. Boris Johnson, who was the foreign minister, came and repeated. And when the British read to the UN why they want to change the vote, they quoted our statistics that I mentioned to you before, 67 on the world, 68 on Israel. There's no other source for that. It comes from us. So sometimes, friends, we can see that something you say and do actually makes a difference, and a country pulls out or a country changes their vote. And I'm not saying we made them change their vote. Those are usually when the prime minister calls, of Israel, calls someone, then you can really get a change of vote. But they had to explain it. They looked for something and they used our materials. But I want to be honest with you. In most cases, it's impossible to change the votes. For the reasons that I described, it's so entrenched. There's so many interests. Israel is much more important than it was in 1948, but it's still small compared to the many that are against it. So many cases we're losing the votes. And then I still believe that we can make a difference. I believe that it becomes our job to explain to the world who stands behind the votes. Most people in Germany, I am sure, and most people in France and Switzerland and in this continent, when they read the headline in the Süddeutsche Zeitung and other newspapers, the United Nations Human Rights Council decided, wow, the United Nations Human Rights Council. They imagine men with long white beards, dressed in white robes, strolling along Mount Olympus, making their decisions based on facts, logic, or morality. Am I wrong? This is what most people imagine. The United Nations Human Rights Council. This is, and the Lord spoke to Moses at Sinai. It's gospel. And when in reality, sitting around the table at the United Nations Human Rights Council is not Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, but Gaddafi, Castro, and the House of Saud are sitting around the table time and again. And that's a message that we get out to the world every day when we expose who sits on these bodies. And sadly, it's again and again and again, whether it's the UNESCO Human Rights Committee, whether it's the UN Women's Rights Commission, which includes the UN Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, Commission on the Status of Women includes Saudi Arabia and Iran are sitting on the Commission on the Status of Women. When Saudi was elected, we exposed that. It was buried in a UN press release. The UN was hoping no one would see it, but we saw it. And we reported it. The United Nations a year and a half ago elected Saudi Arabia. This is before they became heroes, that they let women drive. The next day they arrested every women's rights activist and started giving them electric shocks. But 2 years ago, before they became the paragons of women's rights, they were elected to the UN Commission. And we exposed it. And it was quoted in every newspaper in the world. I have a Google alert for UN Watch. My phone exploded, right? Because it's just a ridiculous story, right? You're at home, you click, and it says UN elects Saudi to be, on the women's rights champion. And it's crazy. So everyone shared it, and we were quoted in every major newspaper, and as I mentioned, even in Teen Vogue magazine, which I believe is definitely the first time I was quoted in Teen Vogue magazine, and I suspect also the last. But we said electing Saudi Arabia to the United Nations Women's Rights Commission is like making a pyromaniac, an arsonist, into the town fire chief, yeah? So that's the reality. And of course, that's why this Women's Rights Commission never once condemned Saudi Arabia. By the way, Saudi Arabia sits on 4 women's rights commissions: the UN Commission on the Status of Women, the Executive Board of UN Women, which is for gender equality and empowerment. Recently this year, their expert sits on the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, and there's a 4th one that I can't even remember, but send me an email and I'll find it. So it's absurd, right? And we get this message out, and it's reported around the world. Even media agencies that may be biased against Israel, they see something like that. It's just a great story, and it's the facts. So we get that story around the world, and I think slowly some people begin to say, you know what? Maybe it's not Socrates. Maybe it's not Aristotle. Maybe actually it's this crown prince who invites critics into the consulate in Turkey and chops them up. Maybe that's now sitting as the Human Rights Council chair of the panel that selects experts for the world. And I think more and more people know that, and that's a message we get out. I think we can fight back. We're in social media. Those of you who have seen the video of the son of Hamas who spoke at the UN, that was seen 10 million times around the world. If it's seen 500,000 times, then maybe it's everyone in this room and your cousins and your friends in your organization. That's maybe 500,000. When it gets to 10 million, then it really got out there. And it's getting the truth out to the world. Sometimes you can jump above media. If media doesn't cover you because they don't like your message, you do social media, and if it's good, it gets out there, right? So there's tremendous opportunities for telling the truth if it's presented in a way that's timely, effective, and important. And I just share with you as a way to give encouragement for all of you activists that you can make a difference. And I just finished with one example, and then I'm finished, which is we also hold abusers to account. If you have a UN mandate, and you should be a sacred UN mandate, and you don't, you misuse it, you distort it, we try to hold you to account. I mentioned Jean Ziegler. This expert was an expert on hunger for many years. Now he's a Human Rights Council Advisory Committee, 18 years. We exposed that not only he created the Gaddafi Human Rights Prize, which he was proud about in the year 1989. This is a prize that's gone to Hugo Chavez, Fidel Castro, Louis Farrakhan, the head of the anti-Semitic group in America, Nation of Islam. They all received the Gaddafi Human Rights Prize. And in 2002, as I mentioned today, Holocaust denier Roger Garaudy wins the prize, and Jean Ziegler himself. We put it in the newspaper, in the Neue Zeitung am Sonntag. He said it's a lie, it never happened, I don't know anything about it. And then we found the video, finally we found the video of him going up on 29 September 2002 in Tripoli, Libya, bowing his neck as they put the Gaddafi prize around his neck. He said, yes, I did receive the prize, but I gave it back. Okay. A final example, I mentioned Richard Falk, the expert on Palestine. He is so pro-Hamas, even Fatah secretly tries to fire him. If you go in Europe, in Germany, and Switzerland, you say that he supports Hamas, okay, but Hamas, they mean well, they want to make peace, they're conservatives, we have conservatives in this country, so they're conservatives. We need to meet with them. What's wrong with that, right? So that doesn't, to say that he's pro-Hamas, it bothers Fatah, but most people in Europe, they don't really have an issue with that. And it's not in Switzerland. In Switzerland, they invite Hamas to come for dialogue, right? They would never invite me for dialogue, but they invite Hamas for dialogue. But we expose something else, which is that Richard Falk is one of the leading supporters in America of the 9/11 conspiracy theory. You know this theory? Some of you know it, younger people may not. 2001, September 11, 19 Al-Qaeda hijackers crash into planes into the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, killed 3,000 people. Many people around the world, millions of people, not only in the Middle East, but even in Western Europe and America, believe, no, it wasn't Al-Qaeda, but it was George Bush, George W. Bush, Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense at that time, bombed their own people to justify wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Millions of people around the world believe this because they couldn't believe the truth that it was radical Muslims who did this, so it was convenient to believe a conspiracy theory. And Richard Falk supports this theory, yeah? He writes the introduction in the book, the Bible for these, they're called 9/11 truthers. It's called The New Pearl Harbor by David Ray Griffin. Richard Falk writes the introduction. And it's called, he says, David Ray Griffin, the author, is an amazing hero, and everyone should read this book. He's my student, he says. He's a great man. Everyone should read the book. So we exposed this, we exposed it, and we got him condemned by Ban Ki-moon. It's the first time ever that a UN chief condemned a UN expert he said what his remarks on 9/11 were preposterous, and 3,000 innocent people were killed on that day. I condemn what Richard Falk said. We took that condemnation letter that he sent us, we gave it to journalists, 5,000 journalists who write about the UN, that we have their emails, we gather, and within hours we had stories around the world. UN chief condemns own expert for 9/11 remarks. A very strange headline, but ladies and gentlemen, I live in a very strange universe called the United Nations Human Rights Council. So Richard Falk, for the first time ever, was condemned. He was humiliated. His own UN chief condemned him. And the story went around the world. Richard Falk had to resign because of term limits, but to this day, he resigned a few years ago, to this day, every 3 months on his blog, he writes, UN Watch ruined my life. I was supposed to get an academic appointment in Britain, it got cancelled. I was speaking in Australia, they came to protest. And it's not what I meant to say. I didn't mean 9/11 didn't happen. I meant we need to investigate this, that. But finally, a wolf in sheep's clothing, a man who pretends to be a human rights expert, who supports Hamas and many other, effectively Al-Qaeda too, in his apologies for them. One of the worst apologists for dictators and terrorists was exposed as the fraud that he is. So ladies and gentlemen, we're very much up against an uphill battle, but I believe that with determination, all of us in our own way, whether it's sharing something, writing a blog, writing a letter, speaking out, and whatever tools you have, we can make a difference. In an assembly of darkness, together we can light the candle of truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hillel. This brings me to a question. I do believe that everybody in this room who's doing advocacy work has made dents in, let's say, bias that Israel has experienced over the last, since its rebirth as a state. One of the things that I'm always believing is the biggest challenge is how to educate the, let's say, future generations, and to think future generations and sustainability of change. I always see that there's a lack of the will to fund education, to teach, especially today in the changing age of communication, media. There really is not a willingness by the powers that be, for many reasons. I can speak more about Germany. It's a very difficult landscape to make reforms because, let's say, school systems in Germany are as a federal topic, which makes it hard to have a centralized policy on how. So it really doesn't matter what Angela Merkel says. It matters what the local people in a region, in a state say. How I feel without money and no limits barred to the monies, we aren't going to make sustainable change, and it's going to be always harder because the day paper newspapers go away, and let's say, I mean, even the traditional news organizations that today are fighting for market share is dwindling considerably. One of the biggest problems that they face is that the young generations don't believe them anymore, and they're not really, I think, having the tools to face those challenges. So what can we do? Is there anything we can do? And this question goes to all the panelists, to find a sustainable way so that the next political generation will make the dents bigger rather than getting rid of the dents and we have to start all over again. I see my job doing Israel media-related work as very Sisyphean. I always say this, we roll the rock up the mountain, and then for whatever reason, it doesn't really matter what it is, but for a very unjust reason, that rock just rolls back down on us, and we haven't gotten it thrown over that mountain. What can we do? Sustainability is, for me, the big question.
Look, I mean, in this debate, I would argue, as someone who teaches these topics and writes about this stuff, facts don't matter. I mean, you're dealing with an environment that there's an echo chamber. I mean, when it comes to the United Nations, just not to expand on the problem, I mean, the United States, for example, I mean, everybody sees, this model of Eleanor Roosevelt. There's a respect for, the perception when it comes to the United Nations is this is the UN, to Hillel's point, of Woodrow Wilson. It's kind of like people do model UN, they perceive, democracies coming to work together with the idea of trying to solve world problems. Now, the reality, of course, is very different when you have, Gaddafi, Assad, and others, sitting around the table and talking about different kind of issues. But when it comes to trying to make a dent, there has to be, this is part of the transparency. It's part of the education. It's part of, trying to deal, there has to be an understanding of the geography you're dealing with. The modality of the United Nations and the modality of perfection as it relates to the areas that they're dealing with does not exist. And so part of trying to break that mold is to understand that the reality is much more complicated than that and to educate on those issues. I mean, you're not going to be able to always solve problems, within, this kind of glorious way of doing business. There has to be some kind of accountability and transparency as to what is manageable to make actually things happen. With the hope, again, that you can actually move things along. But there is a model of perfection that relates, especially when it comes to Israel, when it comes out of the United Nations, that Israel should be more perfect than anybody else. And based on that, we are judging Israel with that model of perfection. The Middle East is not perfect. This is not a model of John Lennon where you have no religion, no boundaries. This does not exist within the reality of the Middle East at large, period. And so we have to do a better job on the education. And that education requires building breaking the mold. When we talk about human rights, there is also a perception that we're talking about the fact that everybody is equal. The perception that people are all equal, they're all the same, they all want one good, they all want to make the world a better place. That is not always the case. And so if we don't understand the constituency or the geography and the culture and the politics that we're dealing with, we're coming up with unrealistic expectations to solve a problem. And that mold needs to be broken, especially with this younger generation.
Well, one line of operation was discussed here. Is to work. It's hard work, and it has to be done. It has to be done whether it will be a successful or unsuccessful, because it serves the truth. And therefore it has to be done. Second element is that, as an Israeli, I can tell you that Israel will continue to grow and will continue to be a strong country and flourishing country, and that's the best answer to all those attempts. Those attempts belongs to a minority. We feel sometimes, because we are living in this echo chamber, that all the people think like that. All the people are bad, and we are only a few justice fighters fighting for the truth. I'm telling you from, there are people that are reading Psalms in the morning. I read polls in the morning. Every morning I read polls and polls and polls, and I do my own poll. Most of the people in the world don't care about the Middle East. they don't listen to those voices. Most people in the world would like to interact with Israel and would like to have relations. And most of the people in the world are not living in Europe. They're living all around the world. And basically, when I look on Israel, despite all this effort, and I think where we were in 48 and 58, and then 68, and then 78, and then 88, 98, 2008, and 2018, each better. We've done better. Our GDP was growing. We have more relations with more countries. We are more respected. Our economy and tourism and academic life are growing, and that's the best answer on the second line of defense. So we should not neglect the fight. It's an important fight, but we should know that in a world of political life, cynical political life, probably we won't be able to change everything, at least not in our lifetime.
I could actually not agree more with Noam Katz. I want to share an anecdote from 2 years ago with you, 2.5 years ago. I came to Berlin as part of my job at NGO Monitor to raise awareness with members of the Bundestag and decision makers, and I met with a lady who was then sitting in the member of the parliament here, and she was actually chairing the Israel-Germany Association of Lawyers. So she actually had a lot to do with Israel in her daily work. And I went in, and as I was very motivated as an activist, I started talking right away about the funds that Bundestag is transferring to organizations, and they do BDS. And I spoke for like 8 minutes in my clumsy German, and then she looked at me and said, "Aber Entschuldigung, Frau Deutsch, was ist dann BDS?" And I looked at her, and it hit me. Sometimes we create the problem. And it's just like Noam says, the majority actually is not busy with the Arab-Israeli conflict, and the majority of people is not busy with Israel, and when they are, they will tell you, wow, it's a startup nation, or it's this country, that has lots of sun, and there's the beach, and I don't know, TripAdvisor, Tel Aviv was, I think, one of the top cities to visit this year. There's so many, Israeli cuisine is flourishing, and we were yesterday having a fabulous dinner at Shuka Bar here in Frankfurt, which was co-opened with an Israeli chef. There's so many other faces of Israel. So we also live in a sort of an echo chamber. But to bring it to what we then are trying to do in the echo chamber that we are trying to be activists in, I think on one hand we have to continue pushing for the EIPA definition to be adopted more broadly. More and more governments are adopting it. It's the Association of Governments who are trying to adopt a common definition on what constitutes anti-Semitism today. And the new definition basically tries to define that it is not only the old-fashioned anti-Semitism with the crooked-nosed Jew, but actually the modern anti-Semitism very often takes the shape of anti-Zionism and denies the right of the Jewish people to have a country. And that is very important because that will raise awareness also with the decision makers and broader public that anti-Semitism is not only, it's basically anti-Israelism very often. I think also when we engage with whomever it is that we are engaging, we need to first ask ourselves, who are we talking to? We need to talk the language that that person or that organization understands. In September this year, for example, SIDA, which is the Swedish Development Agency, they run a journal on development aid, on their development issues. They ran 22 articles on NGO Monitor. Okay, talking about obsession. Why? Because we dared criticize that they fund organizations that have tied to terror organizations, that they fund organizations who promote blatant anti-Semitism. They fund organizations who field activists tweet things like, I wish death to all Jews. I made their day of Kibbura, which is Yom Kippur, be cursed, etc., etc. So they ran 22 articles on NGO Monitor where they portrayed us. They had this whole visual. It was like a spider net where there was our president's picture was put together with the prime minister's picture, and of course President Trump's picture, and all kinds of. Well, actually, it was sort of a. Yeah, it was a compliment. But then when we filed an official complaint pointing to the fact that the spider's net is one of the most, it's a medieval anti-Semitic motive, you know, speaking about a conspiracy, etc., they were puzzled. No, it was just an infographics, they said. But then when we made an analogy that resonates with the Swedish society, and we said, because they said this is not defamation, because when this was published, NGO Monitor shared these articles, and you know we made a public campaign. So actually they said NGO Monitor benefited from publicity thanks to the original 22 articles. But then we tried to speak their language, so we actually said, well, what would happen, because Sweden is the champion of women's rights, right? So we said that would be as if we said that sex assault woman, you know, victim, someone who survived sexual harassment or rape, if she went public and she went to the media and she complained, then basically the raper should say, well, wait, you actually benefited because you got publicity, right?
When it comes to Europe, it's not a secret, but we have good relations with all sorts of governments in Europe. Our Prime Minister visited the Visegrad state, which is Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the Slovak Republic. He went to the 3B, to the Baltic states. He was participating in the Craiova summit in Bulgaria that connect the Balkan states together. We have a partnership with Cyprus and Greece, and all of that has a lot of interest behind it. Some of them are bilateral interests, some of them are regional interests, some of them are economic interests, like gas and oil. And therefore, we are definitely working within European governments, with the friendly European governments. Some of them are friendly on more things, and some of them are more critical and friendly on other things. And I think that basically, unlike maybe what I would say about the European Union itself, that with Brussels, where we have more tense relation on several issues, I think that with European government we have good relations. There are issues that we are trying to promote. People that were here in the morning heard the ambassador talking or the minister talking. Yes, we don't think that Europe is doing enough regarding the Iranian threat. It's a threat to the well-being and security of the State of Israel. It's destabilizing and the entire region of the Middle East, and that's influencing directly European citizens today. And will influence them more tomorrow if you don't take the necessary steps today. And we think that the European governments on that regard are doing a big mistake, and we are trying to convince them to join the American policy and sanction and to put the maximum pressure on Iran and to fight all the things that Iran is doing, and not to separate between the military and nuclear effort of Iran and the terroristic effort and the subversive effort and the cyber effort and driving refugees because of the destabilization of the Middle East into Europe, not only into Europe, but to the entire region. And the effort that they do to destabilize the routes of energy, because it's Yemen and the Houthis in Yemen and others. And we think that it has to be dealt today before it will be very difficult to deal with it tomorrow. But still, we're very active.
Thank you very much. I think we probably should call it an end to at least the official part. If anybody wants to try to capture some of the experts while they're trying to get away, perhaps, you may try. But there is, I believe, the closing ceremony just about to take place, and my colleague from Brussels needs our roll-up from there, and I would like to help her roll it up. So thank you again, everybody, for participating. I'm so sorry that we can't devote more time, or let's say a few days to this topic, because I think it's one of those topics you'll always find conversations that can take place, dialogue. So thank you very much to Noam, Asaf, Olga, and Hillel for their participation. Thank you very much.